conflict. So I want to talk about Gaza primarily, but also bring in a couple of case studies from the last two greatest rounds of conflict that Palestine witnessed. So the first round of conflict is the Nakba, or what's known in Arabic as the catastrophe. And this took place primarily in the years of 1947 to 1949. And it's very important that we use this 1947 starting date instead of what's typically thought of as May 1948, because it is November of 1947 when the actual fighting between Palestinians and Zionist militias took place. And it was only in May of 1948 when the broader Arab region got involved. So the displacement, or what became known as the Nakba, began in 1947. Then, of course, there is what's known as the Neksa, or the setback in Palestinian memory, and that was in 1967. And it's often known in the West as the Six-Day War. And here you have a picture of the then Defense Minister, Moshe Dayan, and he's quite emblematic of cultural destruction at that time, as he was a sort of an amateur archaeologist, and he used to collect a lot of artifacts. And so he played quite a role in the appropriation of artifacts in newly conquered Palestinian territories. And of course, the main discussion here is the conflict in Gaza that's been going on since October of 2023 until present time. And of course, there is a ceasefire. It's holding delicately, and inshallah, it keeps holding. But you know, it's still under this cloud of conflict. So the question is, why focus on cultural destruction despite all of the more pressing features, namely the loss of humanity and lives being lost?
I'm sorry, Kareem, we are not able to see your PowerPoint.
Interesting. Okay, how about now?
Still not?
No, we are seeing.
We see it, Ahmed. I see it.
I'm not able to see anything.
Maybe some problem with your screen or something like that.
I don't know. Anyway, please continue.
Okay. So the question is, why focus on cultural destruction? And there are a few really poignant insights that I think shed light on this question. And one of them comes from a director named Amr Shomali, who directed a movie called Theft of Fire. And it's a fictional movie about a Palestinian history lecturer who retrieves artifacts that were looted by Moshe Dayan. So he says, the loss of antiquities, archaeology, and artworks meant that we had nothing to show to the world. It led to the point where our existence is questionable. We got dehumanized. Killing us is not a crime because we did not exist in the first place. If there is no victim, there is no crime. So here he links the perception that a people, their very humanity, is linked to some physical proof of that humanity. And in a place like Palestine, that's very contested by different groups, that record of one's existence becomes all the more crucial. And here, moving closer to what we think about in terms of international relations, Dan Shaheen, he had a very insightful comment. He said, as was the case in Sarajevo in 1992, when Bosnian Serb forces stationed in the hills above the city razed the National and University Library of Bosnia and Herzegovina to the ground, the targeted destruction of Gaza's primary public library is a stark reminder that genocide is about more than just the premeditated mass extinguishing of human life. It is also about the calculated, and often vindictive destruction of a people's culture, language, history, and shared sites of community. So here he brings in a parallel between the destruction of Bosnia's national and university library, as well as Gaza's primary public library, the municipal library. The idea that humans are represented not just by their physical traces, but also their intangible culture, what they produce in knowledge and in writing especially. The destruction of these things are also seen as part of destroying them. And just some international law on the subject, what sort of gives this study a particularly relevant international affairs valence is you look at the history of a lot of the different conventions, and you see that they did place an emphasis on cultural artifacts. So you see, even as early as the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, a state that took art, books, manuscripts should be returned to those states. Now, of course, the framing is in states, and this is before the Nakba. But you start to see later on the international law frames it even more importantly, and it stops putting limits on the fact that this happens between states, but it can happen between a state and a non-stated people. But one of the limitations, or rather we could talk about two of international law, are number one, who is a signatory, and number two, how are they enforceable? But in any case, South Africa's 2023 application of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in the Gaza Strip detailed Israel's destruction of Gaza's cultural heritage. So quite a bit of the content that you'll see in this presentation comes from that, even though it was quite early on. And that's something that I hope we can all focus on here, is looking at the dates in which these important cultural sites and artifacts got destroyed. And you'll notice that they happened quite early on in the war, before the turn of the year to 2024. So we're talking about October 7th up until the end of 2023. And that indicates that this was quite often purposely done. They were targeted efforts. And of course, we're talking about what happened at the start of this war, and it doesn't say much about how much got destroyed in the previous wars that Gaza's witnessed, the latest before this one being the one in 2021. I want to talk a little bit about Gaza historically, and this gives us an idea of its importance and how rich it could be in terms of historical artifacts. This map right here represents what's known variously as the frankincense route or road that used to go from southern Arabia to the Mediterranean. And of course, it was much more expansive, but this part just shows southern Arabia. And it was at its peak at about, the 2nd century BC. But the idea that I want to highlight is Gaza was the first port from which goods coming from Arabia would then go across the Mediterranean Sea. So it plays a very significant role, and we'll talk about Gaza's port a little bit, but you can imagine what kinds of artifacts made their way there. And I want to also, just to give us an idea of the depth of Gaza's heritage, I want to talk about a chance encounter I had at the Museum of the Palestinian People in Washington, D.C. And I encourage all of you, next time you're in D.C., to go visit this museum. It's a very modest museum, but it's got some very interesting artifacts. And this one in particular, this was a thobe from Gaza. And for those of you familiar with Palestinian clothing, the thobe is quite a distinct garment that women will typically wear for special occasions, especially at weddings. And a bride's thobe will tell you a lot about where she's from, her family, her religious background, so on and so forth. But you'll notice that purple is not a common color in the thobe. You mostly see, the hues of red, of green. You'll see blue, but purple, as far as I know, only comes from the west coast of Palestine. And this is known as a Majdalawi thobe. Now, what was interesting about this is I asked the curator there, how did they make this dye? And she said that the women would make this dye using seashells from the shores in Gaza. Now, what really interested me as a student of history was that the Canaanites, and one of their they had a few major settlements, Akka, Jaffa, and Gaza were major Canaanite settlements. And we're talking about the second wave of Canaanites who went there, who were known as the Phoenicians. And we're talking about 2500 to 3000 BC. Now, they're called Phoenicians. It's a Greek word which means purple. And they're associated with the color purple because they used to trade in a very, very expensive and rare dye that was the color purple. In fact, this is how purple became the color of royalty. But if you look in the books today, they'll say that they used to make this dye using sea snails. So it wasn't the exact same story that the curator gave me, but there's something to be said about shell-like objects coming from the ocean from which they're making purple dye. So you can imagine from that time, we're talking 3000 BC up until now, some of the same mechanisms for cultural production are still in place in Gaza and the surrounding western coast. And this is something worthy of highlighting. Gaza historically has never been just this small strip of 365 square kilometers that we often hear about now. It used to encompass much more than that, namely about 60 cities and villages around it. And as many of us know, about 80% of the population of Gaza today comes from what is now 1948 Israel. So a lot of people coming from the neighboring areas now live in Gaza. So let's start with a discussion on the Nakba. And this is a case study about stolen books. So from April to May of 1948, almost all Palestinians fled the residential neighborhoods of West Jerusalem. Now, perhaps one of the most famous neighborhoods or villages was, of course, Deir Yassin, which witnessed a brutal massacre in April of 1948. But there were also some wealthy neighborhoods there, and Ain Karim being one of them. And so almost all of these people fled. And from a study conducted that was very, very insightful by an Israeli researcher named Amit, he says that there were 30,000 books taken from West Jerusalem alone to Hebrew University's Jewish National and University Library. Now, his focus was on West Jerusalem, but this was also happening in other cultural centers of Palestine at the time, to where he could also say that tens of thousands of Arabic books were taken from Jaffa by Israeli government to a special library in Jaffa's Jabaliya neighborhood. And there's likely thousands more taken from Haifa and Nazareth, which were also two big Palestinian cultural centers. So there's a big question, and it's resurfaced in recent times, as you can see from this 2012 Haaretz article, about these books. It's kind of become a moral quandary within Israeli intelligentsia. Were the Israelis who took these books preserving them, or were they looting them because they were coming from houses and libraries that Palestinians fled from? Well, it's an interesting question because some processes become almost irreversible, and it sort of answers the question of whether it's looting or preserving. In the 1950s, every book had a sequential number, and beneath this number, staffers would write the name in English. So they would put a code. So they'd put like SAK for Sakakini, and this is you can actually see Seria Sakakini, that's one of the books right there, and Nimr for somebody, presumably Ihsan and Nimr. These were two big book collectors in Jerusalem, and they would be placed on the book, clearly marked as such. But in the 1960s, their names are removed and they're replaced by the letters AP, abandoned property. So they stopped taking these names and they became sort of lost into a greater collection that's known to be of Palestinian origin, coming from these libraries, but it would be very difficult for people to try to reclaim them. Then we go to the Nakba, 1967. And this is a particularly haunting case of cultural destruction, where the Palestine Archeological Museum was appropriated. And now it's called the Rockefeller Archeological Museum. So this was a museum that was established in East Jerusalem in 1893 by the Ottoman authorities, and it was known as the Imperial Jerusalem Museum. The British take over its artifacts when they take over Palestine in 1919, and they move them into a new building by 1938. So from 1948 until 1966, when East Jerusalem is under Jordanian control, it's managed by an international board. But then in 1966, Jordan nationalizes it with the US approval, and under the condition that Jordan does not move the Dead Sea Scrolls. And these were probably the most fascinating and internationally intriguing artifacts at this museum. But then in 1967, Israel takes over East Jerusalem and, of course, its museum. But in what contravenes international law, UN Resolution 242, Israel starts treating this East Jerusalem and this museum in particular as its own sovereign property. So what it does is it moves its Department of Antiquities into the building, and it actually removes the Dead Sea Scrolls to other locations in Israel. And of course, it takes other artifacts for temporary exhibitions outside the country. And I want us to remember this building because it'll play a role in the Gaza war that we'll come to. So I want to mention here the testimony of Asim al-Barghouthi, who was the head of the museum in 1948. So he's describing what happens to the museum when it gets taken over in 1967. Al-Barghouthi, in his testimony, Al-Barghouthi also documented their arrest by the Israeli forces that broke into the museum and how they were taken to the roof of the building and used as human shields for several hours during the fighting. Al-Barghouthi testified what he witnessed. Passing the main hall that was full of soldiers, I saw some of the display cases vandalized and emptied of their contents. Also, I saw antiquities, necklaces, bracelets, money, jewelry, and other objects in the hands of soldiers. Subsequent reports confirmed that the forces that had broken into the museum were paratroopers. So this is sort of a testimony for Asim al-Barghouti and other people who work in museums and archives for oftentimes their willingness to be the last people to leave a war zone because of their deep attachment to these kinds of artifacts. So he was there at the museum until the last minute, and you can see he's describing being used as a human shield, and there are Israeli soldiers looting and vandalizing some of the display cases. Now, just to give you an idea of where this museum is located, if you see here in this map of Jerusalem, you can see here, this is what's known as the Haram al-Sharif or the Temple Mount. And it's located on the eastern side of this. So even today, you have here East Jerusalem, which remains predominantly Palestinian. You have the museum here, but the museum itself is very disconnected from the Arab population. And it's sort of more meant to serve tourists and Israeli visitors. So for example, they don't have open days or special events or school trips for Palestinian students. So it's sort of a museum still located where it was, but disconnected from the people who originally collected its archives and its artifacts, and who many of those things are from the era, the modern Arab era of Palestinian history. So now we get to the Gaza cultural destruction in numbers. Now it's very hard to try to quantify exactly what's happened. And most of the reports, as we can see, come from much earlier. But roughly, I try to categorize 3 different kinds of cultural institutions that were destroyed or at least heavily damaged. So you have museums and cultural centers. And these are museums. Some of them are state-run, and a lot of them were actually private initiatives. And we'll get to a couple of case studies, from each of these categories. But the idea being that in Gaza, there's a rule that whenever you construct or whenever you build, you don't have to give the artifacts that you have. So some of the people there, Al-Khudari being one of them, made quite a big collection just from his own construction projects. And he had a hotel that had this museum. And of course, the hotel got bombed and the museum got looted and then bombed as well. Historical sites, Gaza has many. As I mentioned, it was a Canaanite settlement, but there's also quite a bit in general, from after that. But you have the Al-Dhafar al-Dammari Mosque and the Center for Manuscripts and Ancient Documents. It's an old mosque from the 14th century, but lost within it were about 62 rare book manuscripts. You have the Orthodox Cultural Center. Gaza does have a considerable, although dwindling, Christian population, and they are a long-standing Christian population. They've been there for a long time, as we'll see, but the Orthodox Cultural Center got destroyed. The Umari Mosque from the 14th century, that got destroyed as well, and the Church of Saint Porphyrius. And this is possibly the 3rd oldest church in the world, and its outer buildings got destroyed. You have the old city of Gaza, which, like most historic cities, will have an old city. Its old quarters that were preserved has largely been destroyed. The Anthedon, or what's known as the Al-Balkhiyya, is a harbor that was used by the Romans, has also been destroyed. The Sayyid al-Hashim Mosque, And this is something quite interesting. You'll see it's believed that Prophet Muhammad's grandfather was buried in Gaza. And the trade routes that, we mentioned from the frankincense route, they existed in other, although smaller forms later on throughout history. And the Quraysh in the 6th century were using these routes, and Gaza was the summer destination for traders. Tel el-Ajjul is a Bronze Age settlement. It had a huge graveyard there that has been largely destroyed. And the latest of the big discoveries in Gaza was the Ard al-Muharibin Roman necropolis. And this was a Roman graveyard. And because of Roman burial practices of burying people in a sarcophagi with gold coins and other kind of treasures, they've been able to discover a lot of interesting things. And this has also been bombed. And of course, when it comes to regenerating culture, we can't forget libraries and bookstores. So as we mentioned earlier, Gaza City's municipal public library was bombed. The Samir Mansour bookstore and publishing house, which we'll get to, was also bombed. And the Edward Said Library was as well, the Beit Hanun Children's Library, and of course, with the Umari Mosque, the Umari Mosque's library was also bombed. The United Nations estimates that there were 13 public libraries that were destroyed. If you look at some of the other estimations, and still these numbers aren't close to where they need to be in terms of accuracy, because things are still being discovered. According to the Gaza government's media office, 200 of 325 archaeological and ancient sites in the Gaza Strip have been destroyed. And imagine that's coming from December 2023. UNESCO was able to verify from this figure damage to 75 sites, 10 religious sites, 48 buildings of historical and or artistic interest, 3 depositories of movable cultural property, 6 monuments, 1 museum, and 7 archaeological sites. So now we'll get into a few case studies. St. Porphyrius Church, built in 425 Common Era. And it is in Zaytun. It's in the Zaytun neighborhood of Gaza's Old City. So you can see here Gaza's Old City. And as we mentioned, it's possibly the 3rd oldest church in the world. So what was so alarming about this is how it was used previously as a sanctuary. And in the 2014 and 2018, a lot of the people sought sanctuary in this church. But here you can see, like many Palestinian Christians, Maryam Saba and her family sought refuge within the church grounds, believing they would be safe. But on the 19th of October, as the night drew in, an Israeli missile hit one of the church's outer buildings, killing 18 people and injuring many more. So you can imagine the shock for people who assumed that, like the United Nations buildings, like the United Nations run school buildings, churches and mosques would be safe havens. But of course, that was not the case in this war. So along with, an important part of this building, there was also the death of 18 people. And there was also quite a lot of sniping outside of that church. And to talk about the Rafah Museum, this was a particularly touching case of a lady in Gaza, a highly educated lady, Dr. Sohaila Shaheen, with 2 doctorate degrees in arts education, founding a museum very recently in December of 2022 with her own collection. And it held old court documents, historical documents, traditional clothing, tools. Palestinian embroidery, brass utensils, old agricultural tools, gemstones, old passports, postage stamps, illustrated documents about ancient Palestine, Palestinian women's headdresses, and baskets. So imagine these are things that are very near and dear to the Palestinian people. And especially, as I mentioned, with 80% of Gaza's population originally being refugees, these are things that people were able to salvage and take with them from their ancestral lands in what is today Israel. Here you can see Dr. Sohaila with her some of her exhibitions. And as mentioned, she focused a lot on embroidery, and these exhibitions often attracted women's groups to come visit her museum. But it was destroyed in a missile attack just a few days after the war began. And this was when Rafah was considered a safe zone. So this is completely coming out of the blue. And Dr. Shaheen said, I think, some very touching words. She said, no tree, no stone, no human being, no animal, no heritage is safe here. The treasures of my life and my toil, the dresses, precious stones, old coins, documents, the treasures of my life are gone. This is our condition. This is the condition of the Palestinian people. God help us. And then, of course, here you have Qasr al-Basha. And this was built in the mid-13th century by the famous Mamluk ruler, Zahir Baybars. And it was quite famous because in 1799, when Napoleon made his first inroads into the Middle East, when he was leaving Egypt, he entered Gaza and he stayed there for 3 nights. And this was on his way up to Jaffa until finally being defeated in Akka, Acre. And it was opened as a museum by the state of Palestine in 2010 with assistance from the United Nations Development Program and German Development Bank. And it contained hundreds of artifacts from Canaanite, Greek, Roman, Byzantine, Mamluk, Ottoman eras. And I want to highlight this. Seldom in the Palestinian occupied territories is there an initiative of a great scale that doesn't need foreign funding for it to be completed. So you'll see that quite often you have not only the UN, but you'll have many American, but mostly European, quite often Japanese organizations that will fund these projects. So one would assume that this provides some sort of assurance that these sites will be protected, although that does not seem to mean much. So here you can look at what happened. Qasr al-Basha got bombed, it got destroyed, and you can see what remains here. Just a few pieces of the walls, and with it, all of those things that that were in it. And something important to keep in mind is that, as you know, from observing the war in Gaza, Israel often moved in and out of areas with ground troops. So it's quite often the case that they occupied a place first, having, used these sites as, military outposts, and then later on the bombings came. So this is something important to keep in mind in terms of where those artifacts could be. And here's the story of Samir Mansour Bookstore and Publishing House. This is a very touching story. And it goes back to, if you take a look here at this building here, this was back in May 2021, when Samir Mansour's bookstore got destroyed. And it's very important because not only is this a bookstore, but as a publishing house, it was one of the main translators of foreign works into the Arabic language, and also one of the main publishing outlets for local Palestinian writers. So he says, this was part of Israel's 11-day assault on the Gaza Strip. So imagine in 11 days, this is one of the places that's specifically targeted, not the building next to it or the one behind it, but this bookstore in particular. And he says, I have no relationship with any armed group or political party. This was an attack on culture. And he says, I've lived through 2 intifadas and 3 wars against the Gaza Strip, but never before had his bookshop been destroyed. And this is when? May of 2021. And you see here, he rebuilds it in 2022 and in an even bigger and better way. So here's the grand opening. And this was in a lot of help by librarians and other book aficionados from England who helped fundraise for this. It cost hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars to build this building. Then here again is the image of his bookstore. Imagine this, 7 days after the beginning of the war. So here he has to start again from zero. Now, any discussion of Gaza's cultural destruction would be incomplete if we didn't mention the universities and the educational system that have, in general, been systematically targeted. So you have here the French Le Monde mentions all 12 universities in Gaza have been the target of Israeli attacks. It's a war against education. So you have Al-Azhar University here. This is the branch in Gaza. And you have a child here sitting at one of the school buildings in Gaza. Now, what's really scary about how UNRWA mentions 85% of school buildings in Gaza have been hit or damaged, is that not only does this mean the discontinuation of education that was sort of a given, but this is the targeting of what I mentioned was one of the main places of shelter for Gazans to go to, assuming that they would be safe. So these are schools both by UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Works Agency, as well as by, just regular Palestinian initiatives. And here's a picture, and a lot of this has been documented by Israeli soldiers themselves, of an Israeli soldier, mockingly reading a book as he sets alight the Al-Isra University library. And so this was something that was very well publicized and bragged about on Israeli social media platforms. And, despite its crime and seriousness, as we mentioned in international law. And of course, I want to talk not just about these institutions as physical things, but I want to talk about the people who made them. And I want to talk about the scholars of Gaza. So you have the Euro-Mediterranean Observatory for Human Rights, who have probably been the most active NGO documenting what's been going on in Gaza. As far as I know, they've never stopped having a presence there during this war. They mention that 94 professors have been killed from the 7th of October to the 20th of January. So you can see how many were killed just in the first couple of months after the start of the war. And probably the most well-known and spoken about in Western circles has been Professor Al-Arir, who was a poet and professor of comparative literature and creative writing at the Islamic University of Gaza.
Sorry, Kareem, there's 5 minutes left.
Okay, almost.
Thank you.
And his book posthumously came out. I believe it's called If I Should Die. And very touching. He was a very good English poet. Dr. Sufyan Taye was the UNESCO chair for astronomy, astrophysics, and space sciences in Palestine. And he was also the president of the Islamic University. he died in an airstrike with his whole family. And just to mention about his family, he had a son, Osama, who was a doctor. His daughter Asil was a dentist. His daughter Isra was a medical student. His son Abdurrahman, a 10th grader. His daughter Lana, a 5th grader. And his wife Osama was a chemist. And imagine how hard it is to reach that level of education in a place where 60% of the people live under the poverty line and have very little to spend on these kinds of personal endeavors. And in one airstrike, they're gone. So there is a systematic programming, a systematic killing of scholars in the Gaza Strip. And one that I remember, quite tragically was the death of Shayma Saidam, who died in an airstrike in a Nusayrat refugee camp. And why do I remember her? Because in July, when they announced the Tojihi or major, it's like the Palestinian equivalent of the SATs, but even more so because it's the test that really determines your future. And she got a 99.6%, the highest in all of Palestine, West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. And of course, she was killed in an airstrike. And according to UNICEF, she is but one of 14,500 children who have died in this conflict. Now, last thing I want to go over is the question of how much has been looted and how much has been destroyed. I told us that we remember the quote-unquote Rockefeller Museum and the Israeli Antiquities Authority where it's located, because it all kind of comes back full circle. Eli Escozido, who's the director of the Israeli Antiquities Authority, he shared a video on his X account where he shows soldiers in Gaza at a storehouse of artifacts. And he says, "Have a good week. The deputy director of the Antiquities Authority was flown to Gaza to inspect a warehouse full of antiquities, thanks to the soldier Moishe Ajami." And he also put this video here of these antiquities in the Knesset. That's the Israeli equivalent of the Congress. And he had to, of course, take those down. But in January 2025, Gaza's government media office said the Israeli army has looted money and gold artifacts from the Gaza Strip, amounting to approximately $25 million since the beginning of the aggression. The office also said that dozens of testimonies provided by residents of the Gaza Strip regarding the theft of money, gold, and artifacts are estimated at $24.5 million. And of course, 90 million shekels. This is the currency that's used in Gaza. So you can imagine people had this money in their homes and they got stolen. So, and this, he's talking about this from the past 92 days, the start of the war from January 2025 and before that. So you can imagine just the amount of loss that happened when these places got evacuated. And there's a good reason to believe that before these important sites were bombed, they very well would have been cleaned out. So now I will leave it for discussion and question and answer.
Thank you very much, Kareem, for this interesting and very much engaging conversation. And I'm now opening the floor for any question to discuss with Kareem.
Kareem, I just want to say, I don't really have a question, but I just want to say this is a very well compiled and articulate list of things, and it's very important that it's being documented. So I just want to say thank you for doing this.
Thank you, Abdurraouf. Thank you. And you bring up a very good point. And this is something, for discussion, I'd be interested is, let's say a lot of this, it's painful, it's heavy, and maybe we've seen it with our own eyes over the past few years.